Welcome to the University of York. Welcome too, on behalf of the Kohima trustees, to this evening of remembrance. Our programme tonight is a sampling, an overview of our new, spanking, brand new online book of remembrance, a marvellous thing which has been developed by Sylvia and by Mel, and which this evening, just at this moment, while I talk, it is coming online. It has been launched and it's now available. You can rush home, turn on your televisions and feast in this wonderful book of remembrance. This present moment leads me to reflect on other present moments elsewhere in India and Burma. All history, Croce says, is contemporary history, which can mean a number of things, but at this present moment, it is one of its meanings that I'm going to fasten on. All history is contemporary history. It reminds us that the past was once the present for those who experienced it, who underwent it. It was part of the daily reality of what they did and suffered, as it was for those that we're here this evening to remember and represent, as it will be in the programme this evening, sampling the Book of Remembrance, bringing the present, the today that once existed, home to us again. As we remember the people that we are here to remember and to represent, as we remember them, we seek imaginatively to relive what it was, what it would have been like for them, and in doing so, we become, to a degree, their contemporaries again. We join them imaginatively in their todays. We recently celebrated our anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. But our people have still 6 weeks of hard fighting and suffering in Burma before their war ends. To remind us of how they got there, and to help us again just a little to become their contemporaries, we bring you this programme of remembrance. And to guide us on the journey, we're very pleased and grateful to have Dr Richard Duckett, the historian and teacher. I would have said that he's written 2 books, but there is a third that has just appeared. He's written a most excellent book on the SOE in Burma, and another earlier on the Karen in Burma. He's a great expert on things Burmese in the 1940s. He has now produced another book, a biography, Jungle Warrior, a biography of Lt Col Peacock, and you'll find copies of that on the table as well as of many other books. So I will now ask him to guide us through this long journey, starting in India and finishing, well, not quite finishing yet, 40 years ago, Not quite finishing yet, another 6 weeks to go. Richard.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to what promises to be an extraordinary evening of commemoration and remembrance. My thanks to Sylvia and KET for asking me to be here tonight. It was a huge surprise to receive that email, and I'm really pleased to be able to be here with you. I wouldn't be able to be here with you if school hadn't let me out. So I need to say thanks to Leighton Park School in Reading, for the record, for allowing me to skip a few classes to be here today and tomorrow. So on the subject of school, people often presume I'm a university lecturer because it kind of fits perceptions of where people think an historian should be, especially if they've done a doctorate. This leads on to what I think is a very important point. It's often discussed, and it's the question of who can be an historian. And my answer is a simple one to you tonight. Anyone. It is not an exclusive club. And whether you like it or not, you are in that club. You are here tonight because of your interest in history and the history of your family. You've probably spent hours researching, collecting those family memories and documents, using Ancestry, even going to the National Archives. So why shouldn't you call yourself an historian? If you do, I would say don't doubt yourselves. Get on with the research that you want to do. And importantly, don't be afraid to do something with it. This could be as simple as presenting here tonight. Or, a bit more bravely, it could mean going on a KET webinar. Or further still, you could have a go at publishing, just as Liz has done with her excellent book, Frontline and Fortitude. Thanks to her, I know about the Wasbees, an aspect of the war in Burma that I didn't know anything about until I read that book on holiday last summer. Essentially, personal stories are what history is all about. It's those stories that really grab us. And I think consciously or subconsciously, we empathise with the people we are reading about, who are often our family. We ask ourselves such questions as, what if that had been me? How would I have reacted to that situation? What would I have done? Thankfully, 80 years ago, they gave their tomorrow for our today, so we don't have to find out those questions. And this is why the personal stories we will hear tonight are so important. The Second World War continues to bring people together, 80 years later. People who have something in common, an attachment to a global war that is responsible for so much of who and what we are. I wouldn't be stood here if some chivalrous young man hadn't gone to protect a beautiful young lady when the bombs started falling in London during the Blitz. They ended up getting married and produced my father. But I even wouldn't be here tonight if my family hadn't fought in Burma. Both my maternal granddad and my uncle were in 2 divisions, and my great uncle was a Chindit. It was weekly afternoons after school on a Tuesday spent with my uncle that led me to writing about the Special Operations Executive in Burma. So just as it is Sylvia's connection to her father that has led to her being involved with KET, so I'm here from my family's part in the Burma Campaign too. And it's Sylvia's dad who will start our evening, talking about his arrival in India in 1942.
Bombay, however, was not welcoming. We lay in harbour in sweltering pre-monsoon heat for the first 10 days of June. India Command had not expected us and no doubt regarded us as transients. A British division was more expensive to maintain than an Indian division. When we finally got ashore, we were entrained 90 miles up country to Kirki near Pune, where we were invited to occupy 8-man tents in a muddy field in the dark some of the jocks discovering painfully what scorpions are. The rations were dehydrated potatoes, onions, and bread. Before leaving for KET, we had been allowed a day in Bombay where, wearing solar toppies, khaki shirts, and knee-length shorts, with turn-ups designed obviously by somebody who would never have to wear them, to be turned down in the evening to protect one's knees against mosquitoes. We looked ridiculous among the dhotis, saris, and homespun tropical suits. Bombay, like Cape Town, was untouched by war, but had uneasy political undertones to which my first conversation with an Indian introduced me. As we walked up Feroshamata Road from the docks, we stopped at a shop to leave my watch for repair. I asked the Sikh jeweler for directions to the nearest police station. "Why," he said, "do you want to go to the police station?" I explained that we had a school friend who lived in Bombay and we hoped the police would help us to locate him. The Sikh regarded me sardonically. "My friend," he said, "you will learn that the police in India are not here to help people, and neither are you."
The Sikhs' reaction at the end of this excerpt is not so surprising. India was a very unsettled part of the empire in 1942. By that date, the now well-known Hindu nationalist Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi had been back in India for 27 years. He was just about to launch the third of his famous satyagrahas, the Quit India Campaign, which proved hugely disruptive exactly when the war was going badly for Britain on almost all fronts. Within 5 years, of course, India gained its independence, so these men were arriving into a hotbed of nationalism, as this next excerpt from James George Wells, of Dorset, also illustrates. I just mean to read it. By 29th of April 1942, they reached Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone. The lushness and riot of tropical vegetation must have been a sensory overload for those used to the murky greys of poplar. For Lieutenant Havers, this was the Africa of our adventure books and dreams, under the intense heat of the tropical sun, illuminating the whole with the brightness of a colour film. Pop may have lived at the heart of empire, yet what did he know of it? Despite the pervasiveness of empire during the First World War, H.G. Wells claimed that in England, 19 people out of 20, the lower class and the middle class, knew no more of empire than they did of the Argentine Republic or of the Italian Renaissance. A wonderful, hospitable welcome followed in Cape Town on the 15th of May, where they were to spend 4 pleasurable days. Then, a moment of destiny as widespread riots and unrest in India, organised by the Indian Congress Party and Gandhi, led to new orders reaching the convoy commander. Leaving Cape Town on the 19th of May, they were informed they were on their way to India. Many felt cheated. They were proud of their fitness and spirit and ready to fight the Germans. Surely the war was all about Hitler, not India, where the purpose wasn't entirely clear. Despondency developed, leading to another order by Lieutenant Colonel Wood. "Gentlemen, you will like India. That is an order." Within sight of the grand white triple arches overlooking the Arabian Sea, the 16,000 troops found themselves disembarking at Bombay, the gateway to India, on the 2nd of June 1942. Designed in Indo-Saracenic, it had been built by the British Raj to commemorate the visit of George V and Queen Mary on the 2nd of December 1911. Another assault on the senses. The colour and frenetic activity, the heat and the smells. The arrival of the troops in 1942, however, was not to be treated with the same cordial greeting as for the King and Queen. There was great disappointment and bewilderment for the men as they were confronted with placards proclaiming, "Go home, Tommies." This was bewildering for Pop. We thought we were there to help them out. They had not been expected nor made welcome by the military authorities and were duly faced with passive obstruction. This was partly to do with some in India wanting independence, but also because there had never been a whole British division in India before, and it would be India that would need to bear the considerable costs. Bill Stewart, 99th Field Regiment, Royal Bucks Yeomanry, Royal Artillery, also described sailing to and arriving in India. Here is Hannah Gibson, Bill's granddaughter.
On the 13th of April 1942, we sailed away, still not knowing where we were going. Just out in the Atlantic, we joined a large convoy of about 40 ships, escorted by cruisers and many destroyers. The days were spent doing PT on deck and various lectures and playing cards. After many days at sea, our ship anchored in the Bay of Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa for fresh water. The Africans came out to the ship in canoes, shouting for Glasgow tanners. If you threw a silver coin in the sea, they would dive down for it, but not for a penny. The journey continued south, docking in Cape Town on the 12th of May. The next day we were allowed ashore, so we had a few drinks as it was my birthday. While the ship was being stocked up with supplies, we were taken by train to a camp at the foot of Table Mountain for 3 days, but not for a rest. We had climbing to do and route marches. Back on board, we sailed around the Cape, calling in the Bay of Durban, to pick up a VIP, who it was I don't know. He announced next day that we were going to India, so we eventually docked in Bombay on the 15th of June 1942. We were stationed in the area around Ahmednagar. Not much there, just acres of scrubland, not a blade of grass on the football field. We were billeted in large garages and were not allowed out in the midday sun for the first week, but we did our training very early morning and late evening. The following week, we went for an 8-mile route march and had our first casualty. A lad died on the way back through heat exhaustion. After becoming acclimatised, we began going away for weeks to different places to do jungle training. We also did combined operations on Lake Carrickfasler and landings on various islands and the coast of Goa. Scrambling down netting slung down the side of a ship into landing craft, which was bobbing up and down, with a wireless set, a rifle and a pack on your back was very tricky. When making a landing at one place, we had to scramble up a hillside while they fired live ammunition just over our heads. I dived behind a thorn bush and landed on a broken branch. I had 6 or 7 thorns stuck in my chest. I thought I'd been shot.
What struck me about Bill Stewart's account is the similarity to what happened when my jungle warrior, the then Lieutenant Peacock, arrived in Ceylon in 1942. Despite the Indian Raj stretching back over 300 years since the East India Company had first set up shop, the troops disembarked to literally nothing on Ceylon. Getting used to the climate was to be expected, but no facilities in which to do so must have come as quite a shock. Was this really the jewel in the crown of empire? Regarding facilities and infrastructure, the most rehearsed answer to what did the British do for India was always the railways. Part of the shock was certainly down to an incomprehension of scale. The Raj was an entire subcontinent, stretching from Iran in the west to Burma in the east. From top to tail, if you superimpose Burma on a map of Europe, it will stretch from Glasgow down to Madrid. The distance in the next reading is no exaggeration. This is from James Wells. On the 27th of March, the Dorsets suddenly received orders to go to Assam and Dimapur, and the race was now on to join the 14th Army to fight in the Burma Campaign. A journey followed of some 2,000 miles by rail, road and foot. There were soon feelings of shock and revulsion. Travelling across Bengal in the wake of the tragic famine of 1943, in which as many as 3 million people died. The Bengal famine was, of course, a tragedy, and arguments about how it was allowed to happen continue to stir up heated exchanges on the internet and in academic circles. What I normally see missing from these altercations is the fact that Burma exported a 3 million tonne rice surplus to India annually, every year before the war. So with the Japanese occupation, paddy cultivation almost entirely stopped. And that's without factoring in that shipping was getting sunk by the U-boats. So I'm not really a fan of personal Churchill bashing on this one, but his criticism of the Arakan campaign, where Bill Stewart was sent in 1943, as we're about to hear, was unnecessarily acerbic. Churchill described defeat in the Arakan as one of the most disappointing and discreditable which had occurred during the course of the war. He said that the Indian troops were incapable of fighting in the jungle, then commandos should do it instead. The first Arakan campaign, launched in December 1942, just a few months after having been run out of Burma, was a disaster. Churchill is somewhat justified in being angry, but his criticisms were not what was needed at this point. The troops needed some morale-boosting Churchillian rhetoric, and the first lines of Bill Stewart's testimony starkly reveal why. Here's Hannah again.
The Arakan was a horrible place. The front line stretched for about 2 or 3 miles from the sea, and the wide sandy beach on our right through the scrubland to the thick jungle and the Mayu Range hills on our left. The Japanese had the highest point and could see all our gun positions and movements of our troops when attacking. Snipers seemed to be all over the place. The Japanese bombers came over dropping their bombs at ease, as we had no anti-aircraft guns. Our own gun positions were hit one morning. 1 man was killed and 5 were wounded. I had just left to maintain the telephone lines. Ted Tidy and I were responsible to keep the lines to the OP at the front in working order. A very difficult job, as the lines were cut by shells and mortars and by the enemy behind our lines. We later learned that the people causing the trouble were the Indian National Army, who had gone over to support the Japanese. If the lines were cut at night, we had to rely on the wireless, which was not always reliable in the jungle. Ted and I were halfway between the guns and the front line one day, when after a heavy mortar attack, our lines went dead both ways. We usually worked together, one on guard while the other repaired the line, but on this occasion it was decided that Ted would work towards the guns and I would work towards the front line. When I reached there, we had done all the repair work and everything was okay. I was dashing back to the gun positions because it was getting dark and nobody had to move about after dark, when I suddenly noticed the line had been cut where it was tied up in a tree. I knew somebody was about because it was all right 10 minutes before I had repaired it, so I loaded my rifle ready, held it between my knees while I did a very quick repair job, and I can tell you I was very, very quick in getting out of that wood. It was dark when I reached the guns, but the men on the guard wouldn't let me in. We had no password, so I had to give 2 or 3 names till one could come and recognise me. Early one morning, all our lines went dead. I jumped on a motorbike and dashed to find the calls. I soon found out 6 tanks had been moved up to the front, and as most of our telephone lines were laid on the ground in that particular area, they had gone over them and cut them to pieces. I called them all sorts of names to myself, but later in the day I felt very sorry for them. The 6 tanks had gone into Japanese territory, but only 3 had returned damaged. I was stood near the officer in charge of the attack when I heard a wireless operator in one of the missing tanks say, "Sir, we are trapped in a nullah and the Japanese are knocking on our tank and shouting at us to get out. I am destroying my set. Goodbye." Another occasion I shall never forget was when we were ambushed. I was getting ready to go on my job up the front when I was told 4 men would be going with me to carry supplies to our officer and signallers who were up there, and I was to be in charge of the party. Halfway up the track, we had to descend into a nullah, which is a bit like a beck. It was fairly dry, just pools here and there with banks about 10 feet high on both sides. About 150 yards into it, mortar bombs rained down on us. We dived for cover into the bankside sheltered by a tree that had fallen down. Luckily, no one was hurt. The The firing stopped, but just as we decided to go on, we heard someone moving on the bank above. I loaded my rifle and waited till he popped his head over while the lads ran back out, and I followed. We waited quite a while, then I said we would have to go back in as there was no other way, and we must get the supplies to the lads. We all cocked our rifles at the ready, and I led them back in. Things turned out all right. We got the supplies through, mended our telephone lines, and all returned safely.
In all, there were 3 Arakan campaigns. The first, as already mentioned, from December 1942. The objective was Akyab Island, where there was an airstrip to be recovered, from which aircraft would have the range to cover most of central Burma. Unexpectedly, the Japanese were able to reinforce the peninsula with troops from central Burma, and they manned defensive bunkers that proved impenetrable, even with close artillery and tank support, as we've just heard. When the offensive finally ended in early June 1943, the Indian Army was back where it had started. It had been another humiliating reverse for Allied arms, which is why Churchill was so outspoken. Our next reading refers to the reverses suffered during the first Arakan, while recounting action in the second Arakan offensive. Here is Lucy Green, daughter of Alexander Alec MacDonald, Regimental Signals Officer, 4th British Field Regiment Royal Artillery, 5th Indian Division.
Rosaville was a small round hill nicknamed the Tortoise from its appearance on the Ordnance Survey map. It was at the junction of the road between Mongdor and Butidung and the main road to the south. This was the 5th Division's axis of advance. In front of it was a wide open expanse, very like a huge cricket ground, giving it a wonderful field of fire. I first saw Rosaville in company with Major McCosh, a battery commander, when I was with him at an observation post. One group was firing on it, and the rounds came down so accurately, right on target, exactly on the patterns of the 4 guns. Major McCosh reported it as a strong position, platoon or possibly company strength. Strong position indeed it was. The Japanese had dug in deeply and had in fact dug through the Tortoise so that they could retire into it and out on the reverse slope and survive any bombardment. As soon as it ceased up would come their machine guns again, regimental artillery concentrations, divisional concentrations, dive bombing attacks, dummy dive bombing attacks, and finally an attack by the American Strategic Air Force, which covered the whole battlefield with blue smoke, all failed to dislodge them. It was then decided to attack round to the rear of the Tortoise via the right flank, the right hook. This involved a recce to see if it would attract fire. I went out with an officer from each battery, escorted by a detachment from a Punjab battalion, who went in front of us in arrowhead formation. I can still see the moon glinting on their bayonets, and was fascinated by the hand signals they used to get us through their frontline positions. We got safely back without attracting fire from the Tortoise, although the Tortoise was firing tracer to the front. The next night, my own line party and 2 from each battery went out again with our infantry escort. We were to lay 7 lines in all to the start point on the far side of the Tortoise, to be completed next day as the attack went in. The cable drums went click, click, click due to the design of the reels, unhelpful when trying to move stealthily behind enemy lines, but still we attracted no fire. We left the lines on the start point for tomorrow's attack. We checked them through, all were okay, except mine. We worked back along my line and found a maker's fault on a brand new cable drum, which we repaired and all got back safely. The attack went in the next day and was successful. Razorbill had held up the advance of the 5th Division for 3.5 months, November 1943 to February 1944. An amazing achievement. Some years later, I attended a lecture by Lt Col John Slim, son of Sir William, when he said that he had escorted a party of very senior officers, including Sir Philip Christopherson, to view Razorbill. They felt the approach to the position across the cricket ground was so exposed that they adopted arrowhead formation, just as our escort had done. It must have been a strange sight.
It is the second Arakan that more people are more familiar with because of the Battle of the Admin Box. Indeed, the Admin Box was established shortly after the attack just described, which took place in early January 1944. In February, the Imperial Japanese Army launched Hago in an attempt to draw forces away from Imphal and Kohima in the north. At the now infamous Battle of the Admin Box, the 7th Indian Division, who had been trained for 2 months in 1943 by the jungle warrior Edgar Peacock, held their nerve when surrounded and the Hago offensive failed. This provided a much-needed morale-boosting victory, demonstrating at last that 14 Army could outfight the Japanese in the jungle. The war-winning potential of air supply had also been demonstrated, and troops began to feel more confident, which was just as well, because the main Japanese offensive, known as Ugo, the so-called March on Delhi, was launched within weeks of Hago in early March 1944. The Japanese feint in the Arakan had failed to draw Slim's forces away from Imphal and Kohima, but now the opposite was true. 5th and 7th Division, bloodied and Arakan, were able to be transferred to Imphal and Kohima, respectively, to help counter the Ugo offensive. Between March and July 1944, the turning point battles of the Burma Campaign were fought at Imphal and Kohima, producing hard-won but vital victories for the Allies. Here's Bob White, curator of the Kohima Museum.
My father, Dennis White, drove a tank in Burma. He hardly ever spoke of it, although he once mentioned that a Gurkha had accidentally been shot one night and that everyone was very distressed. He advised me to stand well away from descending parachutes in an airdrop, but I've never had occasion to follow that advice. I only discovered that he was in the admin box on the last occasion I saw him before he died. I found the video about the Burma Campaign and I took it when I visited him. We were sitting quietly watching it, and then suddenly he said, "That's where I was." The video was describing the Battle of Admin Box. It's not famous, and at the time I knew nothing about it. Now that I'm better informed, I'm choked that I cannot discuss it with him. He wrote home regularly, and I found the letters when I sorted through his things. He mainly wrote about trivia, such as what he had to eat. There's a long gap beginning in February 1944 until he resumes a month after the battle. D.H. White, 25th Dragoons RAC, India Command. Dear Mother, Dad and Sylvia. There follows a page describing various letters he received, and then he continues, "A lot seems to have happened since then. I understand there's been some reference to our regiment on the London radio, but I don't know how much you've been told. Anyway, it's pretty obvious that this is the first time we've had the initiative or done much against the Japs. As the Japs always repeat their tactics if once successful, be it jiu-jitsu or war, we were able to anticipate to a certain extent, and a nasty situation was turned round as a bit of a boomerang. It was when I heard of our mention by name on the radio, and also that we were unable to get or send mail for 3 weeks, that I sent a telegram. His letter says no more about the battle, and alas, I don't have that telegram. So I'll tell you what General Bill Slim said about the Battle of Aden's Box. He wrote that it was the first occasion in which a British force had withstood the full weight of a major Japanese offensive. Its effect on the whole 14th Army was immense. The legend of Japanese invincibility in the jungle was smashed. It was one of the historic successes of British arms. It was the turning point in the Burma Campaign.
So, from Arakan up to Kohima. The siege of Kohima is one of those battles that really shouldn't have happened. All the Japanese needed to do was bypass this tiny colonial outpost in one of the most remote parts of empire and keep marching on to Dimapur. If they'd skirted around Kohima, it would be a wholly different story. And perhaps we wouldn't be here this evening. And my uncle and my grandfather would not have come to help relieve a siege in April 1944. I'm sure everyone here knows something about the nature of the fighting at Kohima. So just briefly, the fighting was brutal and close. My Uncle Cliff told me about being in a foxhole with his Bren gun, hearing his mates fighting for their lives to the left and right of him, but he couldn't see anything in the pitch black. When it all went quiet, he told me about the terror he felt and the feeling of being alone in the dark without knowing what was going on. Alert for the slightest sound. It's strange because although I can't remember the rest of what 15-year-old me was told, I still have the image he painted in my mind of him looking out over his Bren gun in the mud, scared as hell. Let's go to our first video. Lauren Turner Roden, The Siege, which was presented at the Albert Hall for the RBL Festival of Remembrance.
My name is Lauren Turner Roden, and my grandfather, Raymond Street, fought with the Royal West Kents at Kohima. Too young to understand his stories while he lived, I will be forever grateful that he left our family his written memories. He said of Kohima, "I was 24, but felt 100. All of us young men had seen too much in too short a time. I believe they called it living a lifetime in a day. I don't know about that, but what we had seen during the last few months was enough for anyone. I think everyone prayed at some stage. I did. It was all we had left sometimes. Trapped in my trench, I would read a strip of paper with prayers and writing from St. John. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. I read it over and over again. Our casualties were mounting. We lost several men that day. Not one was older than 21. Would it be our turn next? No one was going to take our place or do our job for us. Every man on this hill had been picked by fate, and some, maybe all, would die. My grandfather came back, allowing me to stand here today to share his memories with you. The Kohima epitaph is engraved on the memorial to the 2nd British Division in the cemetery at Kohima. It makes a simple request. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today."
How she held herself together to do that. It's very hard to talk about our loved ones. Next up is Jerry Bird, talking about his uncle, who was also in 2 Division, but he was serving with the 2 Dorsets at Kohima.
Cyril John Bird was born on the 2nd of July 1924 in the North Devon market town of Chumley to John and Evelyn May Bird. By the time he was called up for active service, 4th of March 1943, Cyril was working on his grandfather's farm in Chumley as a horseman, in modern day parlance, a tractor driver. After basic training at Colchester, Cyril was posted to his home county regiment, the Devons. His initial posting was to the 8th Battalion of the Devons for home defence duties, here, or not far from here, in Craythorne, North Yorkshire. In late October 1943, orders came forth and he was posted overseas to join the 1st Battalion, the Devons, who were already in India. Along with other comrades from the Devons, he joined the Dutch passenger cargo ship Marnix van Sint-Argonde at Liverpool. The ship departed on the 24th of October 43, but was sunk off the North African coast on the 9th of November after being attacked by Luftwaffe torpedo bombers. Fortunately, the ship did not sink right away, and none of the 3,000 plus passengers and crew were lost. Finding himself in Algeria with only the uniform he wore, Cyril was transported to Oran in Algeria and eventually embarked on another ship bound for Bombay. He eventually arrived in India on the 19th of December. From the 20th of December until the 31st of January 1944, Cyril underwent the usual acclimatization training for those who arrived from Europe at the infamous Dualali transit camp. On the 31st of January 1944, Cyril, along with 60 others who were at Dualali, was transferred to the 2nd Dorsets, and thus he became a Dorset and part of the British 2nd Division. Cyril was a member of 8th Platoon A Company. His platoon commanding officer was Lieutenant Jock Mirrells, and the company commander was Captain John Bowles. After being raced across India to Dimapur with the news of the Japanese invasion, from the 11th of April 1944, the Dorsets began their fight towards Kohima, eventually arriving on Garrison Hill on the 26th of April. In the early hours of the 27th, the Dorsets made their first attack in Kohima. A Company took the treacherous route around and down the left side of Garrison Hill. Their objective was to secure a position near the DC's bungalow, overlooking the traffic control point on the Manipur Road below. Under constant fire and sustained casualties along the way, by first light, A Company held a tenuous position in front of the bungalow. This painting was painted after the war by Lieutenant then Major Jock Mirrells, and it shows the Dorset's position on that morning. Whilst the 7th and 9th platoons attempted to go down onto the road and try and circle round the bungalow, 8th platoon was ordered to make a frontal attack and try and take the bungalow and clear it of its Japanese defenders. Although the attack was initially successful and the Dorsets made it into the bungalow, they immediately came under heavy and sustained fire from nearby Japanese bunkers, forcing the survivors to withdraw back to their position above the traffic control point. 8th platoon had practically been wiped out. Post-war, a veteran told my late father that it was within the bungalow that Cyril was last seen alive, leaping over a wall. Initially, he was listed as missing in action, but sadly, this was amended a few hours later to killed in action. Aged 19, Cyril was one of 27 Dorsets killed on that day. Such was the intensity of the fighting. And these are photographs from my visit in 1995 to Kohima. And Cyril is buried with his fellow Dorsets, fittingly, more or less, in front of where the DC's bungalow once stood. He's never forgotten, and he continues to be remembered to this day by us, his family, and we're very proud of him. As his headstone reads, he died for us all.
The 2nd Division was originally supposed to deploy to Arakan to replace the 7th Indian Division, but the rapidly developing situation around Imphal and Kohima meant that on the 21st of March, the division received its warning order to be ready to move to the Burma front on the 26th. On the 27th, new orders were received. Proceed direct to Dimapur. The story of 2 divisions Royal Engineers is told in the book Sussex Sappers, one of the few things left to me by my uncle. On page 125, it reads, "It should be realised that the division was dispersed for training in various parts of southern India. A great many men were on leave, but the urgency of the situation was so great that with unprecedented efforts by the movement control and the RAF, the division started to arrive at Dimapur on the 2nd of April. The leading 5th Brigade arrived from that date, and the last part of the division, 4th Brigade, was flown in by air between the 10th and the 15th of April. Just a fortnight to assemble and move a completely mobile British division approximately 2,000 miles must surely be a record." It's interesting to read that 208 Field Company formed a box at Bokar pending the arrival of 2 Dorsets, who arrived on the 4th of April. Number 2 section, and I'm pretty sure that my Uncle Cliff mentioned being in 2 sections because he wrote a poem about it, they were out with the Dorsets from the 6th to the 8th of April before moving up to Dimapur on the 10th of April. So it's not impossible to imagine that Jerry's uncle and my uncle may have actually rubbed shoulders with each other during this time. In any case, just 5 days after the Japanese had attacked Kohima Ridge on 9th of April, the 5th Brigade was ready to go into action. Quite a feat in itself. But now they had to deal with the terrain. To give some idea of the ground through which our relatives fought is another excerpt from the Sussex Sappers. The ground was enormous and steep, the defensible localities small, and there was much dead ground. It was not until it was seen that the difficulties could be assessed, and there were more than enough difficulties in the weeks which followed. But what the Japanese had achieved could be outdone by British soldiers. Our next reading gives some idea of the sad loss of life involved in undoing what the Japanese had achieved. Here's Mel reading for Mary Langshaw, daughter of Keith Howman, Signals at Kohima.
Keith had an early wartime escape. He and his family, returning from Montreal on the SS Faneuil Head, were torpedoed on the 14th of September 1939 and rescued by HMS Tartar, which was dispatched by HMS Ark Royal. The only family loss was one of his mother's shoes. Weeks later, he became a natural sciences undergraduate at Cambridge University. He was advised to complete his degree, but wanted to join the army as his father had done in the First World War. After his 2nd year, now in the Royal Corps of Signals, he was posted to Catterick. He wrote home weekly. Soon posted to India, he sailed from an unknown port, which turned out to be Liverpool, via Nigeria to Bombay. To the disgust of those on his boat, they were kept on board over Christmas. Troops from other boats were allowed to disembark at Durban. thence to Pune, and soon afterwards, when the Japanese threatened to invade Kohima, the 14th Army were rapidly transported by train across India to Dimapur. From there, by road, up into the hills, 5,000 or 6,000 feet high, home to the Angami Nagas. The day they arrived within sight of Kohima, Keith's batman, with him for just 14 days, dug him a trench. Keith told him that he must have it, because he had dug it. His batman accepted, but sadly it was shelled, and his batman died beside him. His batman was Private Gordon Ollier of the Worcestershire Regiment. He died aged 33 on the 14th of April, 1944. He is remembered with a plaque in the Kohima Cemetery. His personal inscription reads, "For each of us he did his best. Grant him, O Lord, eternal rest." Fighting ensued. So many senior ranks lost their lives that Keith was rapidly promoted to captain. The terrain was exhausting, and they felt fortunate that they were soon able to advance south through Burma, although it was about 6 weeks before they could take their boots off. Keith was mentioned in dispatches for his service and later became a founding member of the Kohima Educational Trust.
It's a bit funny the things that are remembered, such as not taking off boots for 6 weeks. There's some psychology behind that, I'm sure. But it's the psychology behind some of the details in the next reading that British soldiers never really understood and found it very hard to cope with. It's testimonies like this which meant for many veterans, and my uncle for one, reconciliation with the Japanese was something that he couldn't entertain. Next up is Sylvia, reading for Don MacDonald, son of a Cameron who served at Kohima.
Murdo was working in Glasgow as a male nurse in Hawkhead Hospital when at the age of 20 years he travelled to Inverness and joined the Cameron Highlanders in January 1940. He did his training at the Cameron Barracks in Inverness and remembers how his company used to do route marching from Inverness to Nairn to get them fit for battle. "I know how the Jacobites felt before Culloden," he said. In 1942, like so many others, his company sailed from Liverpool to Bombay as part of the British land forces in the Far East battle against the Japanese, a journey that took them 10 weeks. When the Camerons landed in Bombay, it was in the monsoon season, and they had to spend the next year training in jungle warfare. The company then moved to Kohima as part of the 14th Army, made up of British and Commonwealth soldiers. It was common practice to send patrols behind enemy lines. On one occasion, a patrol never came back, and Major Graham picked 4 of his most experienced men. One of these was Murdo. The patrol worked its way behind enemy lines looking for their comrades. After searching, they found no sign of them at all and decided to return by a different route. It was on the way back that the strong smell of death hit them. Moving carefully forward, they looked over a mud wall, only to see the bodies of their comrades. They had been captured and were mortally wounded. Major Graham knew that they would have to retrieve their ID tags. Murdo volunteered to retrieve them. He moved carefully toward the remains of his comrades, and when he was about to reach them, he heard the click of a safety catch. It was an enemy patrol which had been lying in wait. Murdo dived over the wall as they opened fire. He returned fire with his rifle and grenades, killing 7 of the Japanese patrol. It was then he realised he had been wounded and was taken to a field hospital where he was told that one of his toes had been shot off. After a short period in hospital, he then returned to the front line.
There were some men who were able to walk the path of reconciliation after the war, and one such man was Gordon Graham. In many ways, this issue of reconciliation comes back to those empathy-based questions that I posed at the start. Can we imagine ourselves, like my uncle did, boycotting anything that was Japanese-made for the rest of our lives? Or would we have been more magnanimous and sought closure on our horrific experiences through reconciliation, like Eric Lomax, the railway man, did? Either way, a whole generation had to find their own means of overcoming their demons, experiences that for many had been up close and very personal, like when my uncle jumped in a trench with a dead Japanese soldier, or Captain John Morton in his next reading, for which he was awarded the Military Cross. His Sally Cohen, daughter of John Morton, 394 Battery, Royal Bucks Yeomanry.
Our father, John Morton, served as a gunner with 394 Battery of the Royal Bucks Yeomanry, part of 2nd Division at the Battle of Kohima. It was there he was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry on Garrison Hill. Although he never spoke of his wartime experience, he did leave diaries and notes, and we have used these to capture a little of what life was like in the operations post from 24 to 29 April 1944. I checked my kit and felt more than ever like a Christmas tree, he wrote. To reach the observation post 100 yards below required him to run zigzag and heavily laden across the open sniper-covered route. Pack on back, side haversack, water bottle, map case, periscope and Sten gun, skeleton shaving kit, spare socks, pullover, OXO, metastove, water sterilizers, magazines, matches, cigarettes, message pad, emergency ration, torch, spare bulb and battery, latrine paper, whiskey, binoculars, compass, 100 rounds of ammo and 2 grenades, biscuits and tin sardines. And my revolver as an extra, hidden away in my pack for the moment so it shouldn't show me to be an officer. The main OP was 5 feet deep, 10 feet long, 3 feet wide, roofed with timber and soil. A 2-foot crawl trench led to a shallow dugout that looked out at right angles to the main OP. He noted it had an embrasure, an opening, opposite the entrance, and anyone entering was silhouetted against the skyline to the enemy 100 feet below. An old parachute had been draped over the entrance, but the Japanese kept a medium machine gun permanently trained on the embrasure, and there were many holes in the parachute. It was not considered a healthy spot. The Japanese attacked the garrison on the night of 28-29 April, coming within 10 yards of the OP's communication post. In the ensuing fight, our father was wounded in the shoulder, possibly from a ricochet from a machine gun. For 6 hours, the enemy attacked from 3 sides, some from as close as 5 yards. 5 of his group of 8 men were wounded and their survival increasingly at risk. He wrote, "I don't think I'm going to get out alive." They were eventually relieved and he was awarded an immediate MC for his actions. As described in the citation, great damage was inflicted on the enemy by the gunfire brought down by Captain Morton, who put himself in great peril every time he spoke on the wireless, owing to the proximity of the enemy. Captain Morton remained at his post throughout the night, killing a Japanese officer 3 yards from his position with a Sten, and was engaged in a grenade slinging match with the enemy 10 yards away from 0200 hours until they were driven out by a counter-attack at 0700. All this in spite of the obvious pain from his wounds. Throughout he showed a great coolness, judgment and courage of the highest order. Afterwards, 3 weeks after returning to England in 1945, John Morton married Peggy Fryer. She was a Fanny and they had met in Tewkesbury a few months before he left for India. Despite the distance, their relationship flourished by correspondence. His diary notes, 15th November, home. 16th November, engaged. 4th of December, wedding. 3 exclamation marks. In the post-war years, he continued to serve his country. and had a distinguished diplomatic career in which he was awarded both the KCMG and KCB.
Dealing with their experiences after the return to family life is something that I wrote briefly about in Jungle Warrior, linking it to veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. Eric Lomax blamed his war for the breakup of his marriage, as did Major Poles, who had served with Lt Col Peacock almost all the way through the war. Miraculously, they somehow stayed together throughout. Peacock himself led an estranged life with his wife and from 1946 until his death in 1955. A very powerful book I read as a teenager. It stayed with me, and I wanted to recommend it to you tonight because I think it really helps us to understand just how hard that transition is from war to peace, returning to families and loved ones. The book's called When Daddy Came Home. I don't know if any of you know it. It was originally published back in the 1990s. It's been republished since. It's utterly heartbreaking. And I'm sure some of you will recognise your own families in the stories recounted within those pages. In our next reading, we hear from the daughter of a very famous tank driver, Ezra Rhodes. So here's Patricia Firth, daughter of Ezra Rhodes, the driver of the tank which sits on the hillside today in Kohima.
Hello, my name's Pat Firth. My father was Major Ezra Rhodes, so I've been called Pat Pavement since I was about 12. I've had to find my way through school, so that's why I became a teacher. I also taught history. My father taught me an awful lot. He was born on December the 14th, 1912, in a very small house in Sheffield. My grandfather was downstairs. My grandmother went into labour. The lady next door popped in and said to my grandfather, Walter, put another kettle on, Walt, there's another booger coming. Which booger came first, we don't know. But my father was a twin, one of 10. At the age of 6, he was selling newspapers. Between 9 and 12, he was peeling potatoes in the local chip shop. At 14, he left school, the year of the general strike. No work. 15, he worked in a steel works making horseshoes. He had to walk through his father's workshop to get to his workshop. If he wasn't 15 minutes early, he was late. That was the discipline he was brought up with. He remembers the soldiers coming back from the First World War, and he said, 1 month before his 6th birthday, I want to be a soldier. His mother said, you will never be a soldier, boy. He went to join up at the age of 17. He was too skinny, too small, couldn't join. 18, 2 inches bigger, 2 stone heavier. He'd been eating dumplings. He was introduced to the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. He met my mother in 34. They married 2 days into 1939, just as war was declared. They had a 2-day honeymoon where they went nowhere. He went back to France. I did ask her about when did we first have sex then? She wasn't really interested in my finding out these details. However, after France, he was called to Sandhurst. He was made an officer and then went to Burma in 42. He started his war in France, and now I'm going to read what he says about his experiences in Burma. In the early weeks of 44, there were constant reports of Japanese infiltration across the Indo-Burmese frontier. Fortunately, a force of Shindits were airlifted to join us as guerrilla fighters. They were excellent jungle infiltrators, having already hampered the Japanese advance. Imphal was already under siege, and the Japanese were on their way to what was the gateway of India, Imphal. We had to stop them from able to be getting there. As Westerners, we believed the Japanese had the ability to live on the land that they captured, but we didn't think we could do that. The Chindiks taught us how to. In the early weeks of 44, Japanese infiltration turned into reconnaissance, and our regiment was ordered into action. We were on the western side of India and had to traverse the whole subcontinent to get to the Burmese frontier. The 2nd British Division had been dispatched earlier, as the Japanese had already crossed the frontier, and 3 major targets were threatened: Imphal, Kohima, and Dimapur. Imphal was under siege. Kohima, there was an infantry battalion, the Royal Kents, who were hanging on by the skin of their teeth. These 3 strategic positions were connected by a single road that ran through the hilly, jungle-infested terrain, certainly totally unsuitable for tanks. Squadron A moved off immediately to Dimapur. Squadron C was dispatched to Arakan. I think I said that right. And I was to follow with Squadron B. The journey was hazardous. The widths of the tanks were wider than the narrow gauge tracks on which they travelled. Then crossing to the Burma Campaign was even more perilous, but we pushed on. We were ordered immediately to prepare for battle. On arrival, we discovered that the area had been cleared, and the 2nd British Division, with the help of A Squadron, had already moved up to the outskirts of Kohima. The steep-sided jungle-covered hillside housed Jail Hill, FSD Ridge, Crooked Pitch, the DC's bungalow above the tennis court, and Naga Village, all of which were occupied by the Japs. The Royal West Kents had been relieved by the 2nd Battalion of the Dorset Regiment, with whom we previously trained in Western India. Through this terrain ran a track that had been cut out of the hillside between the DC's bungalow and Naga Village. There was a T-shaped track that swung to the left of the village, and another one to the right, underneath the hill on which the DC bungalow sat. There was also a left turn which went straight down to the road to Imphal. The Japanese were dug into the innards of the hillside from there, and loopholes in between these hills. They were able to control all the movements in and around Kohima. There were daily battles between the infantry, with assaults on the Japanese position, but with very little success. On May the 4th, 5th, my squadron was ordered to proceed up the track between Naga Village and underneath the DC's bungalow until we came to the junction with the Imphal Road. Then to continue on the track, we got to follow the features of the FSD Ridge and Crooked Picket. There we found the Dorset Regiment clinging on for grim death to open positions facing the Japanese, who were no more than 10 yards away. We put our heavy guns in position, using initially solid shells, followed by high explosives. As soon as we tried further assaults on the Japanese position that we had just blown out, we were shot down by neighbouring Japanese forces. I found it very strange that the Japanese didn't send out patrols to try and scupper our tanks, because quite frankly, we were sitting targets in the dark. The Japanese had sighted their positions extremely well, such that they were supported by neighbouring forces. Later that day, I was ordered to try and get a tank between Crooked Picket and the DC's bungalow, to go down between the 2 hills to see if we get a firing position into the DC's bungalow with a tennis court below. It was here the Japanese were positioned. The strength between the bungalow and Crooked Picket was such that it precluded any controlled descent. As we descended at rapid speed of knots, we crashed into a boulder as the driver wasn't able to control the vehicle. The tank was therefore put out of action. There was no possibility of reversing up the hill. So I gave the order to detank and run for it. In order to cover our withdrawal, we kept the tank engine running to provide power. We fixed the small arms guns in the turret to fire constantly and switched the traversing gear to the turret to revolve constantly. Our escape route was downhill while the guns fired over our heads. We were to go onto the track below as fast as possible, remembering we were behind Japanese lines. We eventually succeeded in getting to our own defences. I then reported to the brigadier about the failure of our mission. He very politely thanked me and said, "I think you better go and change your overalls," the back of which was saturated with my blood. I remembered that when going down the hill, I had my head out of the turret while I got hit by something. I don't even know what it was, but it knocked me to the bottom of the tank. But it didn't seem to harm me. Clearly, when I later took off my helmet, there were 2 holes in the back of it. A bullet had gone through, smashing the plastic lining, and a piece had cut the back of my head. It was a narrow escape. Overall, it proved to be a costly exercise. I'd lost 4 tanks, 2 to mines, 1 had gone over the hillside, and the one I saw driven into a boulder. I saw my father's tank myself in February. I was absolutely amazed at the terrain, the condition of it, what they actually did. There followed a series of attacks by the infantry, supported by our artillery, by the artillery and our tanks. The battles were harder on the infantry than us. Casualties were high. We felt that the DC's bungalow and the tennis court could be knocked out when the Japanese defences would collapse. Finally, I was asked to provide a tank that was going to be winched up to a position on the DC's bungalow, which could only be achieved with mechanical aid. This was provided by the sappers. The tank was put under the command of Sergeant Waterhouse, and the tank itself went forward into the tennis court. The Japanese collapsed and scattered. I'm very pleased to say Sergeant Waterhouse was awarded the military medal for his action. The Battle of Kohima was now virtually over. There was little to mop up, as most of the Japanese had withdrawn. It had so happened the siege of Imphal had been lifted at more or less the same time. It was obvious to us the Japanese had overextended themselves, but they hadn't run out of that fighting spirit. The fighting went on. The next task was to clear the road to Imphal. My father was repatriated in 1945, reunited with my mother after 4 years apart. He never forgot his humble roots. He never forgot his family. He never forgot his colleagues. And referring to his comrades, he said, "They were the finest men with whom it had been my pleasure and honour to serve with," because they'd been together since 1940. Note his use of language. He didn't say command, he said serve alongside with.
Talking about clearing that road down to Imphal made me remember another one of my Uncle Flint's stories. They drew straws, and he happened to draw the shortest straw, and his task was to go out in front of the tank with his bayonet, probing the road for mines. He said it was the other time that he was extremely terrified because he just never knew if he was going to get shot at any moment. He's got this tank right behind him revving its engine, and he's trying to bayonet the ground to find the mines on the way down to Imphal from Kohima on that road. So while we praise the immense bravery of these tank men and the infantry, certainly not my idea of fun, something which I feel is also hugely important to our understanding of the Burma Campaign is the role of the RAF. Without the RAF and the pilots of the United States Army Air Force as well, most of what the Army did in Burma would have been, quite simply, impossible. The admin box was won by airdropping supplies, even bayonets, as Slim writes about in Defeating to Victory. We dropped the bayonets into the admin box and they were fixed and used. The sieges of Imphal and Kohima were able to continue because of this airdropping of supplies. Keeping China and the Americans happy in the matter of high strategic inter-allied relations was made possible through air supply over the hump. The Chindits and SOE both relied upon the transport aircraft, the workhorses of the Burma theatre, the Dakotas and the Liberators. But it was also little planes. Spitfires and Lysanders saved Force 136 guerrillas on more than one occasion. When the fighting got tough behind the lines, they free-dropped ammunition, which went literally straight into the magazines of their weapons in the middle of battle. These aircraft were often unarmed, making them easy prey for pilots flown by the Japanese Air Force, and many aircraft were shot down, taking a terrific toll on the morale of pilots. They needed to know that if they bailed out, they were not going to die in that vast green ocean over which they so courageously flew. Recovering downed aircrew therefore became a priority, and it was something that SOE Force 136 helped with quite extensively. Our next reading and video recording are from an airman's perspective then. Richard Jackson, son of Flying Officer Ray Jackson, will give some background into the work which went into rescuing men on the ground, and then his dad will tell the story of what happened to him.
Thank you, Richard. The following extract is taken from, but not quoted directly from, Shot Down and On the Run by Air Commodore Graham Pitchfork. "The people will certainly not eat you," was the opening sentence of the paragraph dealing with the attitude of the local population, outlined in the Burma section of the MI9 bulletin. This military intelligence organisation had been formed early on in the war, but as recently as April 1944 was integrated with the American MI9X and was called E-Group Southeast Asia. E-Group was tasked to maintain close contact with air-sea rescue, and its chief aim was to organise and implement all arrangements for contacting escaped POWs, evaders from enemy territory, and downed airmen. E-Group Establishment 1 had one specific responsibility in the Burma region and worked closely with the 14th Army HQ, and together with their clandestine operatives were responsible for rescuing 10 downed air crew between February and July 1944. However, due to the vastness of the area, 2 further steps were needed to assist aircrew who crashed where no clandestine field parties were working. The first was the provision of searcher aircraft to locate and report on the survivors. And secondly, a team of parachutists on standby to be dropped in at the scene. A very big factor with a large bearing on any successful MI9 operation was the amount of help that could be expected from local inhabitants, who were disinclined to give assistance, in the majority of cases, due to harsh reprisals inflicted on them by the Japanese. Now, not much of this would have been on the mind of my dad, Flying Officer Ray Jackson, when he prepared to take off from Palel Airfield on March the 22nd, 1944. This was his 5th sortie, and he is one of 6 pilots tasked to bomb and strafe a target, the Japanese lines of communication near the village of Kuki. According to his logbook, and here is his actual logbook, they set off at 2:15 and headed for the target. Here's my dad talking about what happened next.
The RAF Hurricanes were based at an airstrip south of Imphal. Many Hurricanes were shot down and a number of pilots were killed. But when Flying Officer Ray Jackson's Hurricane was hit, he bailed out over Japanese-held territory and was nurtured by Susai Hoshi and his wife in the village of Pek.
I was based on an airstrip called Palel. It's about 100 miles south of Kohima. There were 2 squadrons on the strip, flying Hurricane 2Cs. We were bombing and strafing a place called Cookie, which is about 80 to 100 miles away from our base. And we were dropping our bombs, had just dropped our bombs low over the trees, when I heard a bang on my port wing and looked out and saw engine oil spilling out. My aircraft was about to catch fire as I bailed out, and eventually, when I was parachuting down, I saw it below me, and it was burning then, and it was hitting the jungle. There was a barren patch on a hillside, and I tried to steer the parachute by pulling on the shrouds towards this patch. And I landed rather heavily eventually on one leg.
After 11 very tough days in the jungle, Ray Jackson decided to approach a village.
I was about to turn a corner between 2 embankments, and around this corner came 2 Nagas.
As I was walking along a jungle path, I saw a white man. He was going the wrong way. He was going towards the enemy camp, the Japanese camp. I asked him, "Where are you from?" He said he was an Englishman, and that his fighter plane had been down near here. He was listlessly wandering around. So I took him into my own household and cared for him. He had some injuries, so we tended to his wounds and took care of him. I strictly told my villagers and my friends not to tell the Japanese troops that I was looking after an Englishman, because the Japanese troops would come and after finding him would kill him.
They had these little huts down by the fields, these tiered fields which were cultivated, and that's where the Sushai took me down there, and I was in pretty bad shape, and I managed to take my boots off, and I've never forgotten this Sushai's wife bathing my feet, and she said to me at the time, "You Christian?" And I said yes, feeling very humble indeed, and a very, very undeserving sort of Christian.
We made him comfortable in my hut. There were even threats from more distant Naga people, because at the time, some were still practicing headhunting.
There was no danger from other villagers, and he was well looked after in the village.
Ray Jackson was smuggled back to British lines, disguised as a Naga villager. 60 years later, to express his gratitude to the people of Pek, Ray Jackson donated a gift of the villagers' choice. They elected to have a basketball court, well used and much enjoyed today.
It's given me very, very great pleasure indeed to know that a lot of youngsters are participating in the game and enjoying it.
We just heard about the contribution of local inhabitants. The Indo-Burmese border and Burma itself are home to many different ethnic groups, some of which you may have heard of. Naga, Kuki, Lushai, Chin, Kachin, Karen, Padong, Shan, Bemar. Within each of these ethnic groups, there are often more groupings. For example, there are at least 6 distinct languages among the Kachin. In an age where we are bombarded with how awful the British Empire was, for example, overseeing the Bengal famine, as mentioned earlier, I think it's worth taking more than a moment to take a more nuanced look at the fashionable narrative by considering the role of the people of the Burma Campaign. To me, these are the most forgotten ones. They are our forgotten allies. As Rob Lyman always argues, it was overwhelmingly an Indian army who fought in Burma. Over a fifth of 2.5 million Indian volunteers fought in the 14th Army. They at last are getting their place in the historiography. But all of the peoples just mentioned, their heroism and sacrifice continues largely unacknowledged. For SOE in Burma, This is something I've been trying to address on my webpage, The Men of SOE Burma, where I've recorded more than 16 different ethnicities of those who fought alongside Force 136. This includes the profile of 125 Bema, 83 Karen, 95 Kachin, 34 Chin, 32 Shan Burman, 31 Chinese, and my last count there were 508 profiles, but I believe it's over 600 now, but just 88 of whom are Caucasian. There were approximately 20,000 indigenous peoples of Burma who served with SOE, and that's just SOE. Many thousands of whom were Karen. My book, Serving the Empire, tells the stories of some of those people in their own words, as does The Road to Kohima by Charles Chasey and Harry Fieset. So it makes me very happy to introduce our next contribution, Anushka and Kimaya, who will read from Mari by Eastereen Kire. Mari was their great-grandmother.
The 13th of April 1944. While we were working on our shelter, Marina came to hear that we were in Byaku. She quickly ran down to find us. Avio, Jabu, Anio, thank God you're safe, she cried. Come on, I'm taking you to my shelter. Her husband and an 8-month-old baby were there too. We told her all about the escape to Kesima and the sudden flight from there. You are safe now, she said to us, over and over again. It will soon be over. There were 14 of them in all, including her in-laws. They had dug a huge trench outside their shelter. Marina's people cooked their food outside in the open and slept in the trench at night. But if there were too many planes flying, they never made fire outside because the smoke could draw the attention of either side, and they could be mistaken for the Japanese by the British and could be bombed. People were very careful in places where they camped. By now we had learnt that the Japanese were everywhere, spread all over the jungles and drawing shell fire by their presence. Eat that slowly, Marina said, as she served us warm food and we hungrily ate all that she gave us. Oh, I've never eaten such good food before, Jabu said. Marina laughed softly and explained, it's because you've been starving. The next day, we met Anya Kerekea. She and her husband had escaped from Kohima early in the battle, but had not made it very far as they were on foot and neither were very fit anymore. Byaku was like a little village as it was a large camp. We could clearly see the northern Angami villages from Byaku. Most of the northern villages were occupied by the Japanese. We could see the shelling of those villages in the daytime. At Byaku, food was available, though each share was quite small, because it had to be divided among a large number of families. In the evenings, the men and women would gather around and talk of the ongoing war. Some had said they had given up hope that the British would win the war. Rumours were rife at these gatherings, and some men said that the British army had been rooted out from every direction, but they were still holding out at Garrison Hill, Jotsoma and Zusa. Men voiced different opinions. We have been abandoned by the British and left to the mercy of the enemy, some of the men said, this quite openly. I knew this was not true. By now, we could differentiate the sound of the British guns from the Japanese guns. And many of us knew that the Allied forces were still there, fighting and defending Kohima. Among the soldiers, there were also many of our young men who, like Sam, had gone to join the British troops. They were acting as guides, stretcher bearers and porters for them. In a few days, these young men received instructions to shift the village people and all people hiding in the woods near Byaku to safer places, as the British intended to bomb the area and wipe out all the Japanese in the jungles in the vicinity of Byaku. This message swiftly went around the camp, and there was great activity as people dismantled their dwellings and packed what they would need at the other camp. On the 17th of April, we got up early and packed our belongings. Then we got ready to join the long line of people moving out of Byaku. Jabu carried the suitcase because she was the strongest of us three. Even Aneyo carried a small bundle of clothing. I was still very weak from the earlier accident, so walking was very difficult for me. Nevertheless, we went along with the rest, hoping that we would find a safer place to stay. The path we used was a small footpath which led towards the woods near Kohima. It was a steep downhill climb in places. We had been walking for 5 miles when Jimmy whispered loudly, "Look, there are some British troops." They were heavily armed, rifles ready to fire, and they held grenades in their hands. They had leaves stuck in their helmets and on their clothes, and we were frightened to see them looking very stern and unsmiling. But when they saw us, they smiled at us and waved us on. As for them, they walked silently in a long line towards Narima village, and that was the last we saw of them. The relief all of us felt at the sight of the British uniforms was immense. We talked excitedly amongst ourselves. "This means that the whole area has not fallen into Japanese hands." Jimmy said this with a big smile. "Yes," Marina joined in. "It means the British are still holding some areas in Kohima and beyond. Perhaps then our loved ones were also safe somewhere," was the unvoiced thought we all had.
There were as many as 12 secret and or irregular units involved in the Burma Campaign, including, of course, V Force and Ursula Graham Bauer, who worked with the Naga. It's fantastic that 80 years later, the significant contribution of the Naga is still recognised, and that the Kohima Educational Trust not only maintains a relationship with that community after all these years, but does such relevant work with the descendants of those who took such huge risks to help in the Battle of Kohima. The existence of 12 secret units was enough that at Mountbatten's HQ, an organisation called Priorities Division was formed to coordinate them all. Conversely, the security around operations now began to threaten those operations because incidents of standing on each other's toes began to happen, sometimes with deadly consequences, but almost always causing large amounts of friction between those ostensibly on the same side. For example, it was believed that it was an SIS operation that was parachuted into an SOE area of operations, which led directly to all 3 SOE officers being compromised and killed, along with 7 of their Karen comrades. Of course, by now I've mentioned SOE Force 136 a few times, but more well known, certainly with more ink devoted to them, are the Chindits. The debate over the Chindits' strategic contribution to the campaign rattles on, but what nobody can take away from them, what is absolutely unequivocal, is the stamina, the bravery and the fortitude of these men, as we will hear now from Ben Brownless, whose father, Philip Brownless, served with 23 Brigade.
The weary column of men and mules which made up 44 Column plodded down and then up the slippery mountain tracks, waded through torrents, trudged for miles through thick mud. It was here that some began to suspect the extent of the defeat being inflicted on the Japanese army. An occasional corpse or the carcass of a dead pack pony had been a fairly common sight, but here the column was marching over corpses sunk into the mud, with a helmet or a piece of equipment or a limb showing, and past an almost continuous line of dead pack animals. This continuous line of dead stretched for 20 to 30 miles. The extreme misery of the march is impossible to describe. The incessant rain and the monotonous drips from the trees were relieved very occasionally by the crash of some great tree falling in the jungle below. The men staggered through the mud and up the slopes, borne down by the weight of their great packs. All were tortured by exhaustion because all were sick. We were so upset that few could eat the already short rations. Many were marching with temperatures, and tick typhus had begun to break out. We had been sodden for weeks, were covered in mud, and we stank. Hollow-eyed, wasted, hungry, and yet incapable of eating more than a minute meal, we talked of nothing else but food. Towards the end of the march, the food supply became precarious, and even a small ration difficult to maintain. Some tried to fill the aching void with stewed leaves. 2 small monkeys were shot, and a number shared them. A maitan, buffalo-type animal, was shot and divided among the column. Each afternoon for 5 days, a supply drop had been arranged, and each afternoon a hungry battalion waited in position, listening to the drone of the supply planes as they circled above the clouds, loaded with food, and searching anxiously for a break in the heavy cloud. Food, and food alone, was the subject of all conversation.
When the Chindits stumbled back to the safety of their own lines, and when the men of the regular battalions had a moment between fighting, they were reminded of home and given some conversation by the women of the Wasbies, as described by Liz in Frontline and Fortitude. And similar to the indigenous peoples just described, the role of women in the Burma Campaign is also underexplored. And so it was with the women who supported SOE in Burma. So I started another project on my website over 2 years ago to try and record as many of the 723 women who went out to the Far East to support SOE as cipher clerks, coding and encoding all those messages from all those clandestine radio sets, working as secretaries and organising supplies. Without these women, SOE would not have been able to function. Those operating the signals equipment were responsible for a staggering 1.4 million cipher groups between 183 SOE operational radio sets in 1945 alone. More than 50 of those sets were in Burma. They worked 12-hour shifts, ensuring 24-hour coverage of communications. Apart from working as cypherettes and secretaries, serving tea and cakes and raising morale, many women were in the Far East to nurse. An unfortunate side effect of war is that people get hurt. So nurses were another essential part of the war effort. So our next reading is from Richard Cullen, son of one of those nurses.
There she is. Joan Francis, 1908 to 1992, was a professional nursing sister with Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service and had arrived in India in January 1939. She served at the British Military Hospital in Delhi for most of her time up until 1943, when at some point she treated Charles Cullen, my father, who had contracted malaria in Nagaland during the V-Force operations. In late December 1943, as part of the preparations for an impending Japanese offensive, she flew to Imphal, and after a short stay at 43 Indian General Hospital at Lemagong, drove up to Kohima, 10 miles south of Kohima, where she joined 59 India General Hospital on the 5th of January 1944 as assistant matron. The hospital was evacuated to Manipur Road, that's Dimapur, on the 22nd of March, 3 days after the Japanese attacked Ukhrul, some 80 miles south of Kohima. The attack on Kohima itself began on the 4th of April. By the beginning of April, most of the female nursing staff from 59 IGH had moved from Dimapur to Shillong, that's in India. Joan, however, was transferred to 52 IGH, which had been set up in a Catholic hospital at Guwahati, that's on the banks of the Brahmaputra. She remained there until early June, during which time the hospital was overloaded to exhaustion by casualties from the fighting at Kohima and Imphal. And if you read the war diary of the hospital at that time, it is quite horrific. After a spell in hospital, suffering from stress, she returned to BMH Delhi on the 12th of August 1944. She then married Charles on the 7th of August 1944 at St Martin's Church in Delhi Cantonment. Her marriage obliged her to resign her commission, that's what the rules said, and she left India on the 18th of December 1944. I was born in 1947, the eldest of their 3 sons.
I really hope that what we have done thus far is acknowledge the many people who made a contribution to the Burma Campaign. I'm aware that we've not paid homage to the senior service yet, but of course their role was pretty limited as far as Burma was concerned until 1945. The Navy's biggest contribution, apart from supplying India, was Operation Dracula, the seaborne invasion to retake Rangoon. Boats were used elsewhere in Burma though, of course. The country, which is divided by 4 great rivers with numerous tributaries and chongs, required not only boats for crossings, but also hundreds of bridges. That's something that my uncle spoke about a lot as well, building bridges. So many bridges he had to build on his way down from Kohima with the Royal Engineers. But also including the longest Bailey Bridge of the entire war. So Cliff told me about building those bridges with 208 Field Company as they advanced from Kohima to Mandalay. After the battles of Imphal and Kohima had inflicted the most terrible defeat on the Japanese army, General Slim turned his attention to Operation Capital, the pursuit of the Japanese into central Burma. He expected to fight a big battle in the Great Bend of the Irrawaddy around Mandalay, but of course the enemy didn't cooperate, withdrawing to the other side of the Great River. And this meant that men from 2 Division, like my grandfather and my uncle and Gordon Graham, had to cross the Irrawaddy to keep the pressure on the retreating Japanese. Here's Sylvia May, daughter of Gordon Graham, Cameron Highlander, whose D Company led the first crossing by 2 Division across the river.
On the morning of the 24th, I assembled my company of 96 men. After cutting 8 small pieces of wood to represent our boats and laying them out on a primitive relief map marked with twigs on the ground, we would embark at 10 p.m. and go downstream in line astern until the last boat had passed the tip of the sandbank, and then turn in line abreast and head for the shore. Only ammunition, firearms and rations for 48 hours would be carried. Total silence would be observed. The men at the back of each boat had the pull cords of the outboard motors in their hands, with orders to start the engines if the Japanese should open fire. We would land at the exact spot which we had reconnoitred, which meant going slightly upstream after rounding a sandbank. I went over it again and again. At the end, I read the 91st Psalm from my pocket Bible. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day. The jocks listened intently and dispersed in silence. They never grumbled about going into battle, only about things like shortage of beer and cigarettes or non-arrival of mail. Bonded by being fed up and far from home, all they asked was fairness under officers who shared their hardships, who told them everything they knew, who led the way and at least looked confident and cheerful. Given these conditions, the jocks displayed a dour aggressiveness and were fine soldiers.
With the fall of Mandalay and the Meister stroke at Waitilä, the race for Rangoon was on. Slim authorised Operation Extended Capital, and now the tank brigades and the 2 Corps of 14 Army dashed south as fast as their supplies and the Japanese would allow them. Rangoon or bust. It had to be taken before the monsoon impacted upon air supply. Although he's not known for saying many nice words about special forces in the back of his defeat into victory, there are a number of veiled references to SOE within the pages of Slim's book. Knowing that the race for Rangoon was going to be tight, he made the pragmatic decision to agree to Force 136 deploying in support of Operation Extended Capital. 3 SOE special groups had been nearly 400 miles behind the lines since the 23rd of February 1945. In charge of the central group assigned to a road stretching from the town of Tongu into the Karen Hills was Lt Col Peacock. This was Operation Character, SOE's most successful military operation of the entire war, I argue. The character teams ended up raising, training, arming and leading approximately 12,000 men, 12,000 recruits, just on Operation Character. Men who went to work as guerrillas in the hills and mountains of Burma. Other SOE operations raised thousands more, particularly Operation Nation, which operated in central southern Burma. With the race to Rangoon on, Japanese forces desperately needed to reach a town called Tongu, a town sitting plumb on the road, going south to the capital. There, they planned to regroup and block the 14th Army's advance, but they never made it. And the reason they never made it is entirely down to the guerrillas of Force 136, specifically Peacock's group that was codenamed Otter. They ambushed the Japanese day after day in April, inflicting a terrible toll on the 15th and 56th Divisions, to the extent that they then started going back up the road to try and escape the hills by using a different route. Little did they know that more character teams, Hyena and Mongoose, were waiting for them, where they again suffered alarming casualties. Rangoon was successfully taken by early May, but the SOE teams had to fight on, even as the army rested, exhausted after fighting all the way from Kohima and Imphal. 19th Division was so battle-weary that it barely managed to advance a few miles up the road from Tongu, and actually didn't make contact with the character teams until after the surrender in August. In late June, it was admitted that SOE was responsible for more Japanese casualties than 14 Army. After VJ Day on the 15th of August, the SOE teams in Burma fought on for another month, as the surviving Japanese would not believe that there had been a surrender. In the absence of the army, 11,000 Japanese finally gave up their arms to SOE in mid-September, after Japanese officers seen here had been flown in to the SOE teams to help try and convince their countrymen that the war really was over. And so it is on this 80th anniversary of VJ Day that we remember and pay our respects to all who contributed to the longest land campaign of the Second World War. For me, it's not only about those at the sharp end, and so it's been my pleasure to hear such a spread of testimonies tonight. They say an army marches on its stomach, so we have to acknowledge the cooks. But it also marches in boots, in clothes, with ammunition, and they travel on various vehicles that need drivers and maintenance, which in turn needs roads and bridges and protection from threats in the sky. They need their own friends in the sky and all of the infrastructure behind every squadron. They need expert local help, and they need nursing, and an army of administrators and staff officers to make the whole infrastructure of war work. As we look back 80 years on the Herculean effort that made VJ Day possible, we should be mindful of the uncertain world in which we live in 2025 and hope, indeed act if we can, to ensure that those questions of what would I have done remain hypothetical. For our tomorrow, we are grateful to those who gave their today. We will remember them.
What an amazing evening. It really has been a privilege to be here and to hear these stories. And the first thing I'd like to do is thank Richard Duckett for leading us through the evening, doing it so brilliantly, and also introducing many of the stories of people he's known himself. All I can say is history must be a very popular subject where he works. And I'm sure I wish I could do it all again and go back and learn at the knee of historians such as himself. Please. I think the point he makes that we are all, or all can be historians, is absolutely demonstrated today. The performance has just been wonderful. Personally, I'm humbled by the stories. The more I hear, the more it's frankly hard to understand just what they went through. Completely in awe of the physical strength, of the mental strength that they had to be able to function, let alone prevail in such terrible conditions. You've told the stories. Your families will be proud of you. You've done it beautifully. And it was a privilege for all of us to hear directly from yourselves about your own personal family stories. Looking ahead, Ron has already said that today is the day when we launch the Book of Remembrance, online Book of Remembrance. We were initially, as Sylvia says in the introduction to it, bowled over by the response to it. We've had 73 different stories that are in this online book. But the more I sit here listening, the more I'm not surprised that we've had so many wonderful stories. And I have a feeling that there'll be more to come. So at certain points in the future, hopefully, we'll be in a position to say more in the online Book of Remembrance. And it is both primarily about the people. It's about capturing these stories when we all know them. We didn't, or our forebears didn't really know immediately after the war, as we're hearing. And that was certainly my experience, growing up surrounded by veterans who didn't talk about it. But latterly they talked more. And now we're able to capture it, we're able to keep it for future generations. That's what the Book of Remembrance is all about. And I'm delighted that we'll be able to read some of what we've heard tonight in the book, as well as many more. And in that, putting it together, we were struck by themes that came out, themes that might be as simple as food and not having enough food. But perhaps most striking was the complete regard, the complete respect that the soldiers and the women, the nurses, all had for each other, and how highly they spoke of each other afterwards. And that's been, again, something very special to do. And so I'd like to say thank you to Mel. Mel has been instrumental to that. Actually, it's her idea, I think, initially. But yes, please. So I think at this point, I'd just like to round off the evening to say the glass of wine awaits. So please take the time, have a chance, have a mingle, speak to Richard Duckett, meet whoever you would like to meet. Have a look at the KET shop, because we're always delighted when you do. And thank you very much indeed for being with us tonight. Thank you.